Welcome back to the third part of our exploration of major structural relationships, how to recognize them and why they're significant. So another primary structural relationship is the relationship of causation. This is a movement from cause to effect. In other words, something is stated as the cause, and then the outcome or the result or the effect of that is given. Some key words that will highlight the presence of causation are therefore, so, thus. Those are our key words to look for. Some examples, excuse me, at a macro level, if we think about Paul's letters, for example, the letter to the Ephesians, all the theological teaching that he does in chapters 1 through 3 is the cause for the exhortations that he gives in chapter 4. And notice the really strong therefore at the very beginning of Ephesians 4. In a micro level look in one of Paul's letters, all the things that Paul talks about in chapter 10, verses 23 through 30, about eating and drinking, all of that together is the cause of the command that he gives at the end of that section in verse 31. So to put it in a different way, you could say that the command is the effect of everything that has gone before. So the movement is from cause first to effect. And so you ask, what are each of the elements? What is the cause? What is the effect? What is the meaning of each within the text? And how does this cause produce this effect? And what are the implications of that for interpreting the passage? The flip side, or the opposite movement to causation, is substantiation. This is where the effect is stated first, and then the cause of that thing is given. And you'll see key words like for, or because, or since, as markers that we're moving from an effect to seeing what has caused that effect. Some examples of substantiation. At the end of Revelation, Jesus' words about his return are really the cause of everything else that has gone before in the book. So everything leading up to that is the effect. And then here we find the cause for everything in Jesus' words. In micro level, if you look at Amos chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, the beginning of verse 6 shows the effect, the punishment. And then the verses that follow describe what caused that effect, and that was Israel's sin. So from effect to cause is substantiation. And we ask the same questions here that we asked of causation. Another important structural relationship is purpose, sometimes known as instrumentation, if the actual instrument that achieves the purpose is expressed. And this is a movement from the means to an end. Something happens so that something else can happen. Something happens in order that something else happens. Something happens by means of something else. So these are expressions of purpose. Examples of purpose or instrumentation at a macro level. John chapter 20, verse 31 is clearly the purpose statement for the book. John says, I have written these things so that. And so that looks back then across all of the gospel. In a micro level look at purpose or instrumentation, in Galatians chapter 5, Paul calls believers to live by the Spirit. That's the instrumentation, the how, so that, here's the purpose, we will not gratify the sinful nature. So there is instrumentation before the expression of purpose in that case. So we want to ask questions like, how does the purpose illumine the means in the end? And how do these particular means lead to that particular end? And what are the implications for interpreting the passage? Another very common structure in Scripture is interrogation. And that can be presented as problem solution A problem is presented, a solution is given, or as question and answer. A question is asked and an answer is provided. Both of those are called interrogation. Some examples. The book of Genesis is structured around problem and solution. So it's one of its big level structures is interrogation. The first 11 chapters give us the problem, and the rest of the book gives us the beginnings of a solution to that problem. In Luke's gospel, the parable of the Good Samaritan is given in answer to a question, who is my neighbor? So here we have interrogation at work. And so we ask, what is the meaning of the problem or the question that's being asked? And how is it resolved or answered in the text? And what are the implications of that for interpreting the passage? Summarization is where a writer gives us an overview, usually of what's before that part in the text, but it could be what's coming after it in the text. This is a little different than generalization because a summary usually has some specific elements in it. In Luke's gospel, we hear frequently Jesus went about teaching, preaching, and healing. And those specific elements summarize either what he's been doing or what he's going to be doing in the next unit. So some examples of summarization. Joshua chapter 24, the covenant renewal, summarizes everything that's been going on in the book prior to that. In Romans, we see a summary near the beginning of the book. Verses 16 and 17 summarize the themes that Paul is going to develop in great detail in the rest of the book. And so we ask questions like, what is it that's being summarized? How does the summary happen? Is the summary before or after the illustrations, the specifics? And what are the implications of this for interpreting the passage? Interchange is not very common, but there are significant examples of it in Scripture. Interchange is a secondary structural relationship. It's the alternation between specific elements, A, B, A, B. There's a really clear example of this in the introduction to Luke's Gospel, Luke chapters 1 through 4, where you have a scene about John the Baptist followed by a parallel scene about Jesus, and that happens 3 times in a row. So that's a good example of interchange. Another secondary structural relationship is something called chiasm. And this is where elements are repeated in inverted order. So you get A, B, C, C, B, A. And usually what happens when there's a chiasm, it's whatever's at the middle of the chiasm, particularly if it's an element that doesn't have a parallel. That's where the author is putting the stress. So if you have A, B, C, D, C, B, A, that D element in the middle is where you want to put your attention. An example of a chiasm is in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 10, where we have heart, ears, eyes, and then the reverse order, eyes, ears, heart. That's a chiasm. And then finally, another secondary structural relationship is something called inclusio. This is like a recurrence in that we're talking about a repetition, but this is a repetition that is formally at the beginning and the end of a unit, forming a bracket around the unit. And in a sense, the phrase Son of God in Mark's Gospel in chapter 1, verse 1, and then at the end of the crucifixion scene, functions to bracket all of Mark's Gospel with the exception of the resurrection narrative. So this ends our presentation on structural relationships. Make sure you look at the PDF chart, and any questions you have about these relationships, feel free to use the question and answer forum to start a conversation there. God bless you.